Welcome to Clash of Health. Thanks for being here today. I want to do a part 2 video to the video that I did yesterday on bipolar disorder and take a deeper dive into what are the protective factors which would support someone in their health where they would be less likely to have episodes of mania or depression. And what are confounding factors which would maybe complicate their disorder? Before I go into that, I just wanted to comment on something that I missed. I neglected to say yesterday with lithium, you need to do blood levels to make sure that someone doesn't become toxic when they're on lithium. And there's what's called a very discrete or short therapeutic window between the therapeutic level of lithium and then the toxic level. So it's really kind of interesting. It very much depends on the person. Someone could be maintained at a therapeutic window that's kind of low, a low lithium level, and they do fine. Whereas some people with bipolar disorder who are being managed on lithium almost have to hover near a toxic lithium level in order to have their symptoms managed. So some people could need to be on a lot of lithium in order to maintain a stability, whereas other people might just need a little bit of the medication in order to be stabilized, even though they have similar symptoms when they decompensate. Another thing I just wanted to mention too is oftentimes two or even more medications will be prescribed, which can kind of work together and complement each other, where someone could be adequately maintained on, let's say, a little less lithium because they're on an atypical antipsychotic. And then as I'm learning more and more about herbs from an Ayurvedic perspective, herbs could certainly support someone so that the medication load could be minimized. So let's just talk about protective factors first. What helps people be supported in their mental health when they have a chronic condition such as bipolar disorder? And one of the biggest factors is support systems. Do they have supportive spouses, parents, teachers, therapists, physicians, workmates, friends? Do they have people in their circle who are going to support them and help them to be buffered by this chronic condition? Are they sober? Sobriety is really important when you're dealing with mental health issues. And people use drugs and alcohol to self-medicate sometimes, especially with a disorder like bipolar, where when they're depressed, they might use drugs to help bring them up. And when they're manic, they might use, let's say, alcohol to help bring them down. So sobriety really can help people not relapse, and addiction can certainly complicate the illness. Another factor that interplays is diet. You know, when people are eating a lot of sugar, they're naturally going to have highs and lows. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I eat sugar, I go up and then I go down. And people with bipolar disorder are no exception. When they eat a crappy diet, they're going to be more likely to have mood issues with that said diet. Another factor that certainly interplays is physical issues, physical morbidity, like obesity and chronic pain, which would lend to pain medication, which would certainly complicate any kind of mental health disorders, including bipolar disorder. So being healthy, eating a clean diet, having support systems are going to all really be impactful to help minimize the symptoms of this disorder and the episodes of this disorder. So I spoke about two clients yesterday. One was a man who had a very good job. He was married. He had 2 children. He had very supportive parents. He had friends. He had all the things that would help him not have episodes, or to lessen the severity of his episodes. He also ate a clean diet. He wasn't addicted to drugs or alcohol. He didn't smoke. I don't think his caffeine intake was much, if he had any caffeine intake. So he had all the things that would really protect him. That being said, he did have 2 major episodes of bipolar disorder. His episodes actually occurred before I started seeing him. I don't remember. I think he was just referred to me. Um, I'm not really sure why he started to see me, but when I first saw him, he was stable. He was not in a manic or depressed episode, nor did he ever go into one, fortunately, while I saw him. But he did describe these episodes that he had had in the past, and they were severe. One was I think they might both have been triggered by the spring summer season, with the sun being a precipitant to his decompensation and his activation into a manic state. And his mania presented with psychoses. He ended up going on a spending spree, and the police were called, and there was an altercation with the police because he was in a delusional state, and they didn't understand what was going on with him. So that was how he got into treatment initially. And I think a kind of similar situation happened the second time. But as I said, even though he had a severe presentation of bipolar, he was able to be maintained through the time that I saw him on very, very little medications, where he wasn't like snowed. It didn't affect his ability to, medication wasn't affecting his ability to function. The teenager that I saw her for many years, and she actually transitioned into adulthood during the time that I saw her. The worst episode that she had was the first time I saw her. She did have another episode. I think she was away at school. I want to say she was at like a boarding school for a period of time where she had a second episode that was pretty severe. Other than that, she would have some episodes that would start into like a cyclothymic, bumping up to a hypomanic state, that were abated because she had a therapist that she saw every other week, and she frequently saw me. And with this wraparound service of seeing me, the therapist, concerned parents, she was able to not have the episodes that she initially had. Her initial episode was precipitated in part by drugs and alcohol. Now, she wasn't addicted to drugs and alcohol. I think that the drugs and alcohol precipitated the episode, and also she used them in part to manage her mood disorder. Fortunately, she quit using drugs and alcohol. I do remember at the end, right before I closed my practice, she had a very small, discrete episode that was abated very quickly. And it was really kind of sad. She came in my office, and she just had this recognition as a young adult of this illness that she would have pretty much for the rest of her life, that she would have to deal with. And it was, in some ways, it was kind of beautiful because I could tell that there was a maturity with her, where she knew that as an adult, she was going to need to self-monitor and self-manage this to a certain extent. And that that she was in part tackling it, but there was definitely some grief over, having this illness. So these are some of the protective factors. This young woman was very healthy in many ways. Like, she was athletic. She ate a pretty clean diet. Her parents lived a very wholesome lifestyle. They were pretty much hands-off parents, I must say. Like, they were not your micromanaging parents, especially given her disorder. I felt like they were pretty laid back. And I think in some ways that behooved her because they weren't in her face. There was no one to rebel against. It was almost like she was rebelling against the disease at parts, in part, but it wasn't like her parents were people that she needed to rebel against. So she ate a wholesome diet for the most part. She was a kid, but she didn't eat a terrible diet. She was very athletic. She was an outdoorsy type kid. She did quit drugs and alcohol. She did have a recognition when she tried to drink, I think, at the end, and it spurred a cycle that, she wasn't really going to be able to drink. So she abstained for the most part from drugs and alcohol. And she had a therapist. She had someone who was overseeing her week to week, which was a big protector for her because the therapist and I were in constant communication about how she was doing. So those two clients, even though they both had the most severe degree of this chronic illness, where they both became psychotic and quite manic when they were at their worst, had so many different protective factors that interplayed with them not really needing to be on a lot of medication between episodes. Now, this is not the case for everybody. There are people who have what we call comorbid issues that interplay with the complication of their disease, namely bipolar. And one of the biggest complications is trauma. People who've had sexual, physical, and mental abuse or traumatic PTSD events in their lives really have a harder time with this disorder. And it definitely complicates the prognosis and the ability to be maintained on not a lot of intervention between episodes. And there's really not a lot you can do about trauma except therapy, trauma therapies. To less of an extent, there are medications that can help with nightmares and, hypervigilance and things like that. But therapy is pretty much the only thing that's going to really help. Another complicating factor is drugs and alcohol. People who have addiction issues, either to self-medicate or the disorder is worsened by an already addictive nature, whatever way you look at it, drugs and alcohol compound this disorder and make it more muddled in terms of really the client knowing that they need help and others knowing what's going on with them. They're not really, sometimes it's really hard to tickle out, is it the drugs and alcohol that are causing the symptoms? Is it the bipolar that's causing the symptoms? Often it's both. Another complicating factor can be lack of support systems. So people who are unwilling to go to therapy, it's a big drawback in terms of their ability to navigate this chronic condition. Therapy can be super helpful. Not only can it help support the person in terms of giving them support for having this illness, but also other things that come up in their lives, which create stress. It helps to downregulate all of that impact by having this supportive person in place who's objective. As I said, with the girl that I saw, the young woman, the therapist was also an extra set of eyes on her where she could intervene and call me and say, hey, I think so and so is ramping up. Maybe you need to reach out to them and see them, or maybe you need to reach out to Chris so she can help you with your medication. Diet too can impact. So people who eat a lot of sugar, who have a crappy diet, whose blood sugar isn't managed, where the blood sugar is creating highs and lows, which can mimic or even trigger mania or depression. That's definitely a real problem. So it's super important for people to eat like wholesome foods, a well-managed, well-balanced diet that is low in sugar, gluten. Believe it or not, gluten can trigger mental illness. Someone who has celiac or even sometimes gluten sensitivity are more likely to have mental health issues. It can impair the brain's ability to function. There's a really strong connection between the gut and the brain. And I'm going to put an evidence-based article by the NIH in the notes here about gluten and celiac and gluten sensitivity and mental health disorders, even schizophrenia. So people who have gluten issues often have thyroid issues. The thyroid, be it hypo or hyperthyroidism, can mask or mimic mania or depression. Lifestyle can interplay also. So someone who doesn't have a schedule, who's maybe working different shifts, who goes to bed super late, doesn't get enough sleep, isn't managing their sleep disorder. With depression, you often see hypersomnia, where they're sleeping too much when they have bipolar disorder. And with mania, they're not sleeping enough. In Ayurveda, there's times of day which are more vata times pitta and kapha times. Mania tends to be a pitta imbalance, and pitta is high between 10 and 2 o'clock in the night and the morning time. So, excuse me, that's when we get revved up between 10 and 2, when the sun's highest. And even in the nighttime, we have the most energy from a sleep perspective, where we're going to have most REM sleep, most activated dreams, and most difficulties falling asleep. If we don't get to sleep by 10 o'clock, then that window is missed, and we might even be up till 2 o'clock. So keeping to a schedule is going to be super important for people with chronic conditions such as bipolar disorder. Going to bed at the same time, getting up at the same time, having the same routines, same time to eat, and to sleep is going to be crucial. Now, there's something called rutacharya, which is seasonal changes, and how we need as people to work with these seasonal changes. And as I mentioned in the gentleman, he was triggered by the sun. So for him, being really mindful of not being activated by the sun, maybe avoiding being out between 10 and 2 in the daytime, and maybe avoiding spicy foods, which can activate pitta, making sure that he eats cooling foods, maybe more sweet foods that are whole foods like fruits, and more like leafy greens and vegetables such as that, avoiding sour, the salty, and the pungent foods are going to be crucial for someone, especially this gentleman, when the summer comes along. Maybe someone who has really deep depression with their bipolar disorder, it's not so much they go into mini manias, but they have these suicidal depression, which could definitely be triggered in the winter time when the sun isn't out. So making sure that they get exercise, that they do get out during the day, that they are, you know, out in nature, that they're breathing fresh air, that maybe they have a seasonal affective disorder light in the wintertime. Being careful with travel too. Sometimes people can lose sleep when they're traveling, and that can spearhead a relapse with this disorder. So, just being super careful when someone's traveling to get back on their schedule really quickly. So, those are all factors that can interplay in a positive or a negative way with this disorder. I just wanted to talk about one other thing that can really be an impediment with this very serious chronic condition, but one that can be managed, and that is denial. And I can think of a few clients that I've had who had denial, that they just did not want to come to terms with having this chronic condition, and their lack of recognition that they needed to be involved in care from a lifelong perspective. Just even if it was going to a practitioner a couple of times a year to check in, just to kind of be monitored, even if it was really infrequently, if someone is really well managed, which is not the case if someone has this denial where they're just not going to respect the symptoms that are occurring. And, it was really sad to see. I can think of one woman in particular whose family would bring her to visits, and she just would not acknowledge that she had this disorder. So it really made it difficult to work with her. So, just the recognition of, prevention is cure. And sometimes it's almost like a mechanic where you need to go to the mechanic when your car isn't broken so that when things come up, they aren't, major events with your car, just these little touchstones that can make all the difference in the world. So, thanks for listening. If you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear from you.